Water. You look at our planet, you might notice there's a lot of blue, there's a lot of water. In fact, roughly 71% of planet Earth is covered in water. More interesting to me is that 96.5% of our water is in the oceans. Whether it's free floating in an iceberg, that water, that salt water, is important to life in the ocean, but it's not really available for us to use as fresh water. So what is it about water that's so important? What is it about the properties of water that makes it essential for life? In this video, we'll look at water, its properties, and why it's so essential for living organisms. Let's get started. So we'll start with the chemistry of water. So think back to your chemistry class, and you may remember that different molecules have different properties. Well, water happens to be a polar molecule. What does that mean? All right, well, let's look at water. We know water, H2O, right? 1 oxygen, 2 hydrogens. Well, this is a molecule, and it has some bonds, right? The hydrogen bonded to the oxygen here, that hydrogen bonded to the oxygen. Well, this particular bond that we see in water is called a polar covalent bond. It's covalently bonded because the oxygen and the hydrogen are sharing some electrons here. So that's what makes this sort of covalent bond. It's a polar bond because basically this molecule has 2 poles, a negative pole, and maybe you could think of it as a positive pole. What's that mean? Well, because this molecule has uneven distribution of electrons, right? The oxygen has more electrons than the hydrogen. So because there's so much electrons, so much negativity up here, this creates a negative pole up here, right? Lots of negative electrons. Down here, hydrogen is less negative. So if it's less negative, it's more positive. So this creates 2 poles. We call this a polar covalent bond. Now, what does that mean? Well, what do we remember about positives and negatives? They actually attract each other. So here you can see, if you think about it, this oxygen molecule has a slightly negative charge down here. The hydrogen has slightly positive. So what we'll see here is that this sets up a really interesting situation where we've got negative here, positive here. We know, of course, negatives and positives sort of attract each other. So what that means is the positive end of this water molecule will be attracted to the negative end of this. Same thing here. The positive of this will be attracted to the negative end. So you can see we're starting to form some smaller, weak bonds that take this molecule and bond it to this molecule. We call that weaker bond a hydrogen bond. That's the bond that takes one water molecule and bonds it to another. So let's be clear on our bonds, just to be super clear. A polar covalent bond is the bond within a water molecule, right? Polar covalent. So the oxygen to the hydrogen within polar covalent. Between water molecules, we have these weaker hydrogen bonds. And it's this hydrogen bond that's going to make a lot of really interesting properties of water that are essential for life. So let's look at some of these properties of water. So remember, it's this hydrogen bonding, these polar covalent bonds that are really going to be causing all of these really interesting properties. All right, so the first one, adhesion. If you think of something, if it adheres, right, it sticks to something, right, it adheres to that, like tape is an adhesive. So water actually adheres to other substances. So here you can see we got a little graduated cylinder, and as normal, if you remember from your chemistry class, if you look up, the water actually kind of sticks to the side and forms this little meniscus. It kind of goes up there on the side. We call that adhesion. That's when water molecules stick to other things. Okay? Stick to other things. Like in this case, the graduated cylinder. Another interesting property of water is cohesion. All right, so we had adhesion, now we have cohesion. Think of cohesion as a cohesive group, right? They stick together. If you're cohesive, you're sticking together. So cohesion means water molecules stick together. Stick together. And so what you'll see here is this is what creates surface tension. So when water molecules are sticking together because of these hydrogen bonds, it's creating a surface tension so that something really light, like an insect, can actually sit on the surface of water and not fall through, because there's some surface tension that's allowing that insect to sit on top of it. And that surface tension is created because of these hydrogen bonds and the polar covalent nature of water. All right, so adhesion sticks to other things. Cohesion, water molecules stick together. Another interesting property of water is that it helps to cool us. So if you go for a run, you're sweating, right? Why do you sweat? Well, the water molecules help to cool you as they evaporate. So the water molecules can take a lot of that heat that's in your body, and as it evaporates from you, it takes that heat with it, and so we have evaporative cooling. This is one of the mechanisms that animals, particularly humans, right, use to cool off. We let the water escape from us, and it cools us as it does it, evaporative cooling. Another interesting property of water is the fact that water, in its liquid form, as compared to its solid form, has different properties. So water, when it's ice, is actually less dense than water when it's liquid. So if you think of this, this means that ice will float. Now this is very important if you think about it. If you think of a pond, a lake, our oceans, if water became more dense when it froze, it would sink to the bottom, right? Ice would sink if it was more dense, but it's not. Ice is less dense, so it floats to the top, which allows the life in the pond and the stream and the lake and the ocean to continue living, and the ice doesn't fall down and crush the living things. So that's a very important property, is the fact that water becomes less dense when it freezes and it floats. The next universal solvent, the next property of water is that it is a universal solvent. So it dissolves things very well, right? If you've got something sticky on your hands, you run it under some water. That helps to dissolve those chemicals. You take some sugar, you take some salt, you mix it in water, it eventually will dissolve. You won't see the molecules anymore. Because of the polar covalent nature forming these hydrogen bonds, these water molecules will gather around the other molecules of whatever you put in and help to change the properties so that you can no longer see it. It's completely dissolved in the water. So water is a great universal solvent. Another really interesting property of water, the last one we want to talk about, is that water has a high specific heat, meaning it does not want to change temperature. Okay? So it has a high specific heat. You got to put a lot of energy into it for it to change its temperature. This helps maintain global temperatures, if you think about it, right? I told you 71% of our planet was covered in water early on, and that helps keep the temperature on our planet much more stable because the water doesn't want to change its temperature, right? If you think about early summer, you may have a day where it's 100 degrees all of a sudden, right? The outside air, really hot, 100 degrees. But your swimming pool If it had been winter or been spring before, it's going to take a while to warm up, right? Same thing goes in reverse. If your temperature in your swimming pool is really hot, and all of a sudden you get a cold day, the water's not going to immediately change its temperature and be as cold as it is in the air around us. So this high specific heat means water doesn't want to change its temperature. This is essential for life on our planet. If you think about a place like the desert where there's not a lot of water, you're going to get great fluctuations in temperature. So water helps maintain our temperature, keeps it more consistent, and that's because it has a high specific heat. And I'm showing you right here that water, right? If you want to boil it, they say don't, it takes forever to watch a pot of water boil. That's because you have to put a lot of energy into it to get it to change its temperature. So the last property of water, the last thing about water that I really want to talk about is this idea of transpiration. So think about a tree, for example, a plant. Where's the water? How does the tree get the water it needs? Well, you probably know this, right? The water's in the soil, it's in the ground. So how does the tree get the water that it needs? Well, it brings it up through its roots, right? You've got all these roots down here, they take the water, they bring it up. This process of moving water through a plant is called transpiration. So if we sort of zoom in a bit to some of the leaves here, what you'll notice is that if you look at a leaf, it's got these tiny openings called stomata. And these stomata allow things in and out of the plant. CO2 obviously can go in, right? Oxygen, water might want to go out. So when these stomatas, these little holes, open up, they allow things to move. When they close, not as many things can move in and out. So transpiration is the plant moving the water through its system, through its body, if you want to say, and out, using some of that water as it goes. Well, how does that work? How does the water move through a plant? Is something picking it up and dragging it? It's actually something which we call capillary action. So if you took a really tiny glass tube and put one end of it in water, what you'd notice is because of the properties of water, it's adhesive and cohesive. It sticks to the side and it sticks to each other. The water will slowly move up the small tube. That's called capillary action. And so the same thing is kind of happening here in a plant, where the water molecules are slowly moving up through the plant because water is cohesive and adhesive. Okay? So these properties of water, whether you think about it or not, right, they're really essential to life on our planet. If water wasn't a polar molecule, life as we know it wouldn't exist. So water, it is essential, and it is also essential that you are really familiar with all of these terms about water and its properties.